I first heard from Jim MacDonell shortly after I came to work for Pricewaterhouse. He was head of the management consulting of Pricewaterhouse. I had succeeded in having a partner's article published in the Financial Post, and I got a note from Jim. He told me how pleased he was. I didn't see much of him until after he became Auditor General, and he asked me to write a history of the office of the auditor. I remember him telling me about his shower notes. Apparently he found that he had some of his best ideas in the morning in the shower, so he arranged to have a notebook put in his shower, and whenever he had a good idea, he wrote it down. And so people in the office got to know about his shower lists, which were the agenda for any given day. Jim was a very determined guy. He didn't look like it. He liked to pretend that he was the little boy from Alberta, but he knew exactly what he wanted, and he usually got his way. When Jim MacDonell arrived in Ottawa, he let it be known that he intended to be a watchdog, but not a bloodhound. That was clearly a reference to his predecessor, Maxwell Henderson, whose annual reports used to make headlines because of his attacks on the government. MacDonell had no intention of following in Henderson's footsteps. He told me that whenever he got to speak to Jean Chrétien, Chrétien was Minister of Finance at the time, he said, when you speak to Chrétien about money, a veil of incomprehension descends over his face.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jan Masaryk, Foreign Minister of the Czechoslovak Republic.
Last September, I left Canada after a very, very short visit to take up my duties as the Foreign Minister of the Czechoslovak government in London.
The wartime voice of Jan Masaryk, the man whose words kept hope alive during Czechoslovakia's darkest hours.
When I was in Prague to record a documentary about the Prague Spring, the death of Jan Masaryk inevitably came up. The death of Masaryk, the son of the founding president of Czechoslovakia, had made news all over the world. But for me, there was a personal connection too, because Masaryk had known my father ever since he was a boy, and later he and my father were both delegates on the International Labour Office. Masaryk came to Toronto to visit my family during the war, and at that time he gave me a copy of his photograph with a personal dedication to me. It is one of my most treasured possessions.
But those who loved him best knew him as an intensely compassionate human being who felt the pain of others as though it were his own, an idealist completely dedicated to peace and freedom.
Whether Masaryk died by suicide or whether he was murdered remains a question yet to be answered.
Did Masaryk jump, or was he pushed?
When I spoke to his secretary, a man by the name of Sum, he was convinced that it was suicide. on the other hand, he also introduced me to another of Mossack's secretary, who was of the opposite opinion. He was convinced it was murder. I asked him what led him to that conclusion, and he said many factors.
There's the fact that his apartment was in a state of confusion following his death. The bedclothes were scattered and toilet articles smashed. There's the autopsy report of abrasion marks on Masaryk's chest and hands.
But the main one was that he had found on Masaryk's desk the draft of a speech which he was supposed to give the following day. As this man pointed out, if you are planning to commit suicide, you don't start drafting a speech.
Even if Masaryk's death is never solved, it has taught a definitive lesson to those who thought a man's hopes and spirit could be buried with his body. Knowing what we do today, Masaryk sounds almost like the author of his own epitaph in his last message to Canada, broadcast from Czechoslovakia 22 years ago.
After long, endless, terrible years, my beloved country is free again. You free people of Canada have helped us a lot. We are getting on our feet, my friends, slowly, not without difficulties, but I promise you we shall make good in the end. God bless you, and someday I'll be seeing you again.
I first met George Ignatieff in the lobby of the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa. I mistook him for somebody else, and he obviously wasn't sure who I was either. So we talked for a while, and finally I said, "How is your wife?" And he said, "I'm awfully sorry, I haven't got one." I was so confused because I knew the person I had mistaken him for did have a wife. I just didn't know what to do. I just fled. That evening, my French landlady was having a group of external affairs people for French conversation, and she said to me, "We are having a new pupil tonight, a Mr. Ignatieff." And I said, "Oh, how nice, I'd heard a lot about him." Well, in he walked, and of course it was the man I had met earlier that day. We got to know each other a bit after that, and I knew a little about the background of his family, and I told him how much I'd like to write a book about it. And he always said no, he thought he was going to write it himself. So I more or less forgot about it till one day he walked in and he said to me, "Does the offer still stand?" And I said, "It sure does." Well, it turned out that he had in fact written the story of his life and his family, but the editor at the University of Toronto Press, where he thought it might be published, told him that he had a good story, but he didn't know how to write. So he came to me and he asked me, would I rewrite it? So for the next few weeks, we sat down with each other and we talked, and I recorded our conversations. Finally, I had a revised story, and the only question was, what were we going to call it? George Ignatieff was away abroad at the time, and the editor, Ian Montagnes, and I sat down and we thought of a few possibilities, and finally I said, how about the making of a peacemonger? And he said, that's it. That's what we're going to call it. Well, when George came back from abroad and we told him he wasn't at all sure that he liked it, but he did get used to it, and finally, when the book was published and people asked him, how did you come to call it The Making of the Peacemonger? And he had all kinds of explanations. He had literally forgotten that it wasn't his idea to begin with. Shortly after the Ignatieff book was published, I was talking to Sonja Bata. She mentioned that she had read the book, and she asked me if I would be interested in writing a similar book about her husband's life. I jumped at the idea. I was really delighted. My father had known his father, and I had known Tom off and on, both before the war and shortly after, when we met in Ottawa. And so from then on, we met periodically over lunch whenever he happened to be in town, which wasn't all that often, but whenever he was, I taped interviews with him. When the Bata book was about to be published, it turned out that it was a little too long, so instead of cutting bits and pieces, I decided to cut a whole chapter, and I cut the Chinese chapter, which dealt with Tom Bata trying to establish a joint venture with the Chinese. It led to a visit by him and his wife Sonja to China. They discovered to their surprise that most of the staff were not allowed to eat with them. However, they managed to get around that particular rule. They came to the Bata suite, which was a most luxurious suite, including a bathroom with a huge bathtub, and the Chinese visitors were delighted to be able to take a bath in a tub which had been used previously by President Nixon. Evidently, this was quite an honor as far as they were concerned. The negotiations about the joint venture didn't bear fruit in the end. The Chinese wanted the joint venture to be devoted mainly to exports, whereas Tom Bata wanted it to deal with the domestic market. So they didn't come to an agreement, and the Batas eventually left without any tangible result, except that they were able to export some machinery to the Chinese. As Tom said, it was essentially an updated version of the technology which they had sold to the Russians 15 years earlier. I was in Prague in 1990, shortly after the election of Václav Havel as president of Czechoslovakia, and I was fortunate in that a friend of mine arranged for me to go to Lani, the presidential residence in the country, and have an interview with Havel. There was a moment's panic a day before the interview when I discovered that the battery on my tape recorder was dead, and at that point there were no batteries available anywhere in Prague, except one place that a friend of mine knew about, and so fortunately I did manage to get a battery. I was picked up and driven to Lani for my meeting with Havel. The interview went very well. We talked mainly about his meeting with heads of state of different countries, and he told me about them, about how he was trying to make connections with these people. And I asked him, did that mean that he was hoping for a European federation? And he said, yes, at some point in the future. As it turned out, the EU came into being 3 years later, so it was much sooner than he expected. It was an excellent interview. We talked about his hopes for the future of Czechoslovakia, his ideas about having spiritual people visit Czechoslovakia. We talked about his visit to Canada, and so finally I was driven back to Prague, and that evening there was a reception at the Canadian Embassy in honor of Michael Wilson, who at the time was Minister of Finance. Vaclav Klaus, who was the Czech Minister of Finance at the time, somehow heard that I'd been to see Havel, and he asked me, what did we talk about? So I told him that, among other things, we talked about a possible European federation, and he said, what utter nonsense. A transcript of the interview was published in Maclean's magazine, and at the end of the transcript there was my question, was Havel enjoying being president? And he said no, it was like being in jail, but he had been convinced that it was the good of the country, and so he agreed to serve. People ask me, why were all my books about men? You've got to keep in mind what kind of culture I started working in. After the war, men were coming back from the war, and they were expected to get the jobs which women had had while they were overseas. So the women went back to their homes. Eventually, the baby boom occurred. The women were having babies. They were not active in public life. Admittedly, there were some exceptions. There was Sonja Bata, who was incredibly influential within the Bata organization. It is not widely known that Sonja Bata came up with the idea that there should be shoes with pointed toes instead of the snub-nosed shoes that had been popular all through the wartime years. Sonja was also influential in designing stores and marketing, but above all, Sonja started collecting samples of shoes, and eventually she founded the Bata Museum, which is now known worldwide. Another example of an unusual woman for that era was Phyllis Grosskurth, or Pat Langstaff, as I knew her in our undergraduate years. Pat had a fascinating and unconventional life. She she wrote some very successful books, but she also fought for equal rights for women at the university. I knew Pat well throughout the years. Her second husband was Maeve Moore. I invited Pat to join me on a vacation in Mexico. Pat, who was having an affair at the time with Davidson Dunton, decided to phone him and tell him where she was going and how he could get in touch with her. Maeve somehow overheard that conversation, and by the time Pat joined me in a taxi, she said, "My marriage is over." Pat eventually published her autobiography, and I went to the launch of the book along with my friend Penny Welsh. I remember Penny read the book and she turned to me and she said, "She makes me feel I haven't lived." Some people claim that I was a role model. I don't see it that way. I think I was part of a trend. For instance, when I first joined Pricewaterhouse, there was not a single woman partner within the organization. But then times were different. There was not a single French-Canadian woman within the organization. By the time I left, there were many women partners. There was Diana Chand, there was Kathy Lisson, quite a number of them. It was no longer unusual. Times had changed.